48 minutes later, a sitting U.S. senator would accidentally confess to a multi-million-dollar bribery scheme, only no one knew it yet. The courtroom in Charleston was unassuming: cream walls, dark oak trim, a faint hum from the overhead lights. Nothing about it screamed historic. And yet, everyone inside sensed it. Something was about to shift. At precisely 9:03 a.m., Pam Bondi entered through the double doors, heels clicking with intention, a single folder tucked under her arm. No entourage, no fanfare, just quiet, razor-sharp resolve. Across the room sat Senator Charles Whitmore, decorated, connected, smiling. He had spent the past 20 years perfecting that smile, polished for campaign trails, debates, and television interviews. Today, it was his shield, because today, he wasn't on the podium. He was on the stand. The committee hearing was expected to be another carefully staged formality, a discussion on federal contracting irregularities. Questions would be asked, answers would be vague, and no one would remember it a week later. At least, that was the plan, until Pam requested the floor. Chairman: Ms. Bondi, you may proceed with your questions. She stood slowly, approached the center podium, and locked eyes with the senator. Her tone, measured, professional. But something in the way she paused, just half a beat longer than expected, made the room lean in. Pam: Senator Whitmore, you've stated under oath that you were not involved in the awarding process for the Delco Systems federal security contract, correct? The senator nodded, easy. That's right. Pam didn't blink. She gently placed her folder on the desk, flipped it open. Pam: Then perhaps you can explain why your personal aide was on an email thread, along with Delco executives and your chief of staff, the morning before the contract was finalized. Whitmore's smile faltered, subtly, but enough. A murmur swept across the room. Reporters looked up from their notes. Pam continued, voice steady. Pam: Senator, your sworn statement was that you had no prior knowledge. This email says otherwise. The senator shifted, cleared his throat. Senator: I haven't seen that document. If it's real, I'd need to verify. Pam: It's real, and it's time-stamped. Would you like me to read the subject line aloud? For the first time in the hearing, the room fell completely silent. Pam didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The folder wasn't thick. It didn't need to be, because sometimes all it takes is one document, in the right hands. And the senator was just beginning to realize he wasn't the one holding the cards anymore. The room didn't know it yet, but the quiet storm had already started. Senator Raymond Harlan adjusted his cufflinks with the smug confidence of a man who had spent too many years believing his own legend. The chamber was packed, press in the back row, aides clutching notepads. The ethics committee lined up like silent statues. Cameras were off, but everyone knew someone was leaking this. They always did. Pam Bondi, seated across the room, barely glanced at him. She was flipping through a folder filled with notes, handwritten, not typed, each line sharp, clean, surgical. No theatrics, no legal showmanship, just cold preparation. Senator Harlan, she said, her voice calm but cutting. When you signed off on the Fair Transit Appropriation Act last spring, did you review the vendor contracts associated with the federal disbursement clause? Harlan gave a short laugh, one of those practiced, dismissive chuckles that politicians use to dodge discomfort. Miss Bondi, I don't micromanage infrastructure bills. My office ensures compliance through proper channels. Pam nodded slowly, like she expected that answer. Right. So you wouldn't have known that Tilden Logistics, the firm that received the lion's share of the contract, had previously been fined by the SEC for falsifying transportation compliance records. A murmur spread in the room. Harlan's smile flickered. That's not something I was made aware of, he said, his voice slightly tighter. Pam leaned in, tone still measured. Because they're registered to your former campaign manager's brother-in-law, and the contract was awarded without competitive bidding. Now the room shifted. No one spoke. Harlan froze. Not visibly, not dramatically, but a half-second lag in his blinking, a hand that went still on the desk. He didn't know she'd found that. "Objection," one of the senator's attorneys said from the corner. But no one backed him. Bondi didn't even look at the man. Her eyes stayed locked on Harlan. "Do you believe that public trust is best served by undisclosed connections between elected officials and federal contractors?" And there it was. Harlan inhaled to answer, but Pam interrupted him, not rudely, but precisely timed. "Because the wire transfer you received last August," she continued, "matches almost to the dollar the consulting fees Tilden paid out that same week." That silence wasn't just tension, it was realization. People in the room started pulling out their phones, not to tweet, but to start taking notes. Something had just cracked open, and everyone could feel it. There was a shift, not loud, not overt, but something in the air had thickened. Senator Harlan blinked slowly, his posture still tall but noticeably less at ease. Pam Bondi wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. Her tone was exact, and her words were precision tools. Not weapons, not accusations, just well-placed pressure in the places he had hoped no one would look. She slid a document toward the committee chair. "For the record, Exhibit B, a ledger entry from First Dominion Bank showing a transfer of $87,500 to an account belonging to the Passy Citizens for Infrastructure Integrity, founded by a Mr. Lowell Jenkins, also your former campaign strategist." Harlan leaned into the microphone. "That PAC supports dozens of candidates, not just me. There's nothing illegal about that." Pam's smile was polite. "Of course not. But it's interesting that the PAC's only recorded expenditure for the entire quarter was a payment to Blue Ridge Consulting, registered in Nevada, whose sole employee is your niece." A quiet gasp. One of the aides near the back scribbled a note so quickly it nearly tore the page. Pam didn't pause. "Senator, how do you explain the convergence of those transactions within a 5-day window of the Tilden Logistics Award, given that the procurement process had no oversight from the Transportation Ethics Panel?" "I wasn't aware of those specifics," Harlan replied, his voice lower now. She nodded slowly. "And yet you vouched for the legitimacy of that process on record during a press conference last July. Would you like me to play the footage?" "No," he said quickly. Too quickly. Pam tapped her pen once, then looked to the committee. "Then let the record show that the senator publicly endorsed a contract awarded through a process now shown to be influenced by undisclosed financial ties to his own political network." The room was dead silent again. Somewhere behind the cameras, a committee member whispered, "She's not just building a case, she's dismantling one." And Pam? She hadn't even opened the second folder yet. Pam opened the second folder with the same deliberate calm as before. She didn't glance at the cameras, didn't feed the room with drama. Her power was in the silence, how she made every second feel heavier, every breath tighter. "Senator Harlan," she began, "you testified under oath that you had no direct communication with Tilden Logistics executives prior to the bidding process." "I did," he replied, his voice more cautious now. "Then perhaps you can explain this." She turned the folder toward the room, revealing a printed screenshot of an email chain. "This is from May 3rd of last year. An email from your private server to a Mr. Vincent Kerr, CEO of Tilden Logistics. The subject line reads, 'Preliminary approval in motion. Keep Jenkins looped in.' Would you like to read the rest aloud, Senator?" Harlan's face had gone a shade paler. "I don't recall that email." Pam nodded sympathetically, but there was steel behind her eyes. "That's understandable. Memory can be selective. But your server didn't forget, nor did the IT technician who was subpoenaed by the DOJ 3 weeks ago." Gasps this time. Audible ones. The journalists started typing faster. Even some of the committee members sat forward in their seats. Pam stepped slightly to the side, not to grandstand, but to let the weight of the evidence land fully on him. "The email references Jenkins, the same Jenkins whose PAC funneled funds to your niece's company, and it was sent weeks before the official review board was even convened. I wasn't involved in the bidding decisions. Harlan tried to interject. Pam cut in smoothly. But you were involved in setting the tone, weren't you? In shaping the process. In creating the illusion of oversight while the outcome had already been orchestrated. She let that hang in the air. Not an accusation, not yet. Just a brutal clinical unveiling of facts that didn't line up with his version of events. And then, in a quieter voice, she asked, "Senator, how much of this system is theater?" He looked at her. Silent. Cornered. Pam Bondi wasn't smiling anymore. She was just getting started. The room was no longer a committee chamber. It was a courtroom, and Pam Bondi was in full command of it. She flipped to the third document in her folder, an internal memo, time-stamped and signed by a senior staffer in the Senate Appropriations Committee. "Let's walk through the timeline, shall we?" She paced slowly, almost casually. But her voice, steady as stone. May 3rd, you email the CEO of Tilden Logistics. May 6th, your niece's shell company receives its first installment from Jenkins Pack. May 10th, you meet privately with Director Landry of the Department of Transportation. She held up a visitor log. Location, the Hart Senate Building. No aides present. The conversation wasn't recorded. She turned to the panel. That same week, the evaluation rubric for the logistics bid was quietly amended, and Tilden, once ranked 4th in feasibility, suddenly leapt to the top spot. Senator Harlan was trying to hold still, but his jaw was clenched so tightly it looked like stone. His hands, folded on the desk, were trembling ever so slightly. Pam didn't stop. "Senator, there are only two possibilities here. Either you wielded influence behind closed doors to secure favorable treatment for a company with which you had personal and financial connections, or the entire trail of documents, timestamps, and financial transfers is one massive coordinated coincidence." She stepped closer. "So which is it?" The senator looked up, his confidence now fully eroded. He glanced toward his attorney, then back to Pam. "Those meetings were informal, and I never promised anything." Pam held his gaze. "You didn't have to. You positioned the players, cleared the field, and moved the goalposts. And then came the moment that would end up on every highlight reel across the country." Pam placed her palm flat on the table and leaned in, eyes locked on his. "Senator, you keep calling this an inquiry, but I've read the depositions. I've traced the donations, and I've heard the silence between your answers. This isn't an inquiry. It's a reckoning." The room held its breath. And Senator Harlan, he just sat there, because for the first time in his career, he had nothing left to say. Cameras outside the chamber caught the buzz before the news even broke. Inside, the ripple was louder. Reporters scrambled to upload quotes, legal analysts inched closer to their mics, and staffers exchanged wide-eyed glances across the room. But Pam Bondi didn't flinch, not even a little. She reached for the final document in her folder. "This," she said, holding up a thin, dog-eared envelope, "was mailed anonymously to my office 3 days ago. No return address, just a single sentence on the back. He never thought it would come out." She opened it slowly, deliberately, as though tearing through the last illusion of innocence. Inside, she continued, unfolding the enclosed page, was a copy of a wire transfer confirmation. $10,000, from Jenkins Pack to an unregistered LLC, registered days later to a woman who shares a home address with your campaign manager's brother. The senator tried to interrupt, "Objection, this isn't—" But Pam cut him off with the sharpness of a judge's gavel. "You'll have time to object, Senator, right after you explain to the American people how public trust became your private currency." The gallery behind her erupted. Half gasps, half stunned silence. Pam didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She could feel the shift in the air. The moment people stop wondering if something's wrong and start knowing. She walked back to the center of the room and let her voice drop just enough to sound like it was meant for him alone. "See, I think you thought this would be like every other time. Deflect, deny, delay, and then it fades. The news cycle forgets. The public loses interest. She took a breath. But this time, you left fingerprints. Senator Harlan stared ahead, his expression now hollow. Gone was the arrogance. Gone was the practiced charm. All that remained was a man who realized too late. Pam Bondi had cornered him in a room full of witnesses, and there was nowhere left to run. The room fell into an eerie quiet. Not silence. Attention. That kind of stillness that only comes when something irreversible has just happened. Phones didn't ring, chairs didn't creak. Even the stenographer had momentarily stopped typing. Senator Harlan tried to reach for composure, but every movement now felt forced, mechanical. His hands, once expressive and confident, just gripped the edges of the podium like a man gripping the edge of a cliff. He cleared his throat. "Ms. Bondi, this is a smear campaign." Pam didn't even blink. "A smear campaign doesn't come with receipts, Senator." She turned toward the committee members now, slowly, letting her eyes land on each of them. "You were all sent here to serve the public, not to protect one another from it. So ask yourself, if this is what's visible in the light, what do you think he's hidden in the dark?" A rustle of discomfort moved through the room. One committee member shifted in his chair. Another looked down, as if suddenly unsure whether they wanted to make eye contact with the truth. Pam let it sit for a moment, then stepped back toward the senator. "Let's go back to the Grantville project. You approved a federal subsidy of $6.8 million for a company that, coincidentally, shares your former law firm's mailing address. That's circumstantial. And then, 2 months later, you reported a sudden financial gain in your blind trust, just shy of $500,000, from an undisclosed investment vehicle. Care to tell the chamber how those two events are unrelated?" He opened his mouth, closed it. Pam didn't wait for an answer. "Because I already pulled the real estate filings, Senator. I already talked to the clerk who processed the zoning exemptions. I already have the emails. Yes, the ones your aide thought deleting would be enough." The senator looked around now, not for support, but for exit. But there wasn't one. Every camera in the room was now on him. Every viewer at home had stopped scrolling, stopped talking, just to watch this moment unfold. Pam took one final step forward and lowered her voice just enough for the mic to strain to catch it. "You didn't just break the public's trust," she said. "You sold it, quietly, repeatedly, and for far less than it was worth. And then..." She stepped back, folded her notes, and said nothing more. Because sometimes silence isn't the absence of power. It's what power sounds like, when the truth has already done the speaking. By the time the chamber adjourned, the echo of Pam Bondi's words still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. No dramatic music, no thunderous applause, just quiet, uneasy. The kind of quiet that comes not from peace, but from reckoning. Senator Harlan remained seated longer than anyone else, his face pale, jaw tight, the illusion of control finally stripped away. Cameras flooded him, but for once, he had nothing rehearsed to say. No statement, no deflection, just the weight of exposure sitting squarely on his shoulders. Outside, the hallway was a storm. Journalists scrambled to file their reports. "Pam Bondi exposes senator's secret ties in live hearing," one headline read. "Federal committee rocked by evidence of corruption," read another. On social media, clips of the hearing exploded, particularly that one line, "You didn't just break the public's trust, you sold it." Pam didn't stop for interviews. She never did. She walked straight through the crowd, calm, collected, not because she wasn't affected, but because she knew the real battle was never in front of the cameras. It was in the pressure rooms behind the scenes, where backdoor deals and whispered promises had once ruled unchecked. Not anymore. The Senate Ethics Committee announced a formal investigation before sundown. Pam's office received over 40 requests for interviews, 3 speaking invitations, and, quietly, 2 anonymous thank you letters. One from a junior staffer who'd left Harlan's office last year. the other from a retired auditor who had once flagged the same discrepancies but had been ignored. Pam read them both. She didn't reply. She just placed them in a folder labeled accountability, because that was the whole point. This wasn't about political sides. It wasn't about headlines or vendettas. It was about drawing a line between those who use power and those who serve with it. Later that night, while others debated motives on cable news and panels argued about fallout, Pam stood alone in her office, staring out at the Capitol dome glowing under the night sky. She whispered one sentence under her breath, not for show, not for soundbite, but for herself. This is what justice sounds like, when no one can shut it down. And in that silence, a quiet shift had begun, one that would ripple far beyond a single hearing. Because once the truth is spoken out loud, there's no unhearing it.